Somewhere in the middle of the South China Sea, a small wooden fishing boat is caught between two giants. On one side, a vessel flying the flag of the Philippines, crewed by ordinary fishermen trying to make a living the same way their fathers and grandfathers did for generations. On the other side, a massive steel-hulled ship belonging to one of the most powerful military forces on the planet. Water cannons open up without warning. The fishing boat rocks violently. The men on board hold on for their lives. Nobody sent them there to start a conflict. They just wanted to catch fish. But in the South China Sea today, simply being Filipino in your own waters can be treated as an act of provocation. This is what is happening right now, and the consequences stretch far beyond a reef, a fishing boat, or even a nation. What is unfolding in those waters could reshape the entire balance of power in Asia, threaten global trade routes worth trillions of dollars, and pull the world's most powerful nations into a confrontation nobody has a clear plan to stop. To understand why this matters so deeply, you have to start with geography. The South China Sea is not just a body of water. It is one of the most strategically important stretches of ocean on the planet. Roughly a third of the world's maritime trade passes through it every single year, carrying goods estimated to be worth around $7 trillion. Beneath its surface lie an estimated 11 billion barrels of untapped oil and nearly 200 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. The islands, reefs, and shoals scattered across it are not just rocks. They are potential military outposts, surveillance stations, and launching pads. Whoever controls this sea controls enormous leverage over the economies of Southeast Asia and beyond. And for decades, one nation has been quietly, methodically, and at times aggressively working to control every inch of it. China's claim over the South China Sea is sweeping in its ambition and controversial in its foundation. Beijing asserts sovereignty over roughly 90% of the sea based on what it calls historic rights, represented by a boundary known as the Nine-Dash Line. This line cuts deep into the exclusive economic zones of 6 neighboring nations, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia, as well as Taiwan. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled decisively that China's Nine-Dash Line had no basis in international law and that the Philippines held legitimate rights to the resources within its 200-mile exclusive economic zone. China rejected the ruling completely and has never acknowledged it. Instead, Beijing has continued building, expanding, and fortifying its presence across the sea in ways that now define the nature of the conflict. The artificial islands China has constructed in the Spratly Islands are one of the most remarkable and alarming engineering feats in recent history. Over the course of just a few years, China dredged millions of tons of sand and coral from the ocean floor and turned submerged reefs into military-grade installations. Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef now have runways long enough to land military aircraft, deep-water harbors capable of docking warships, hangars, radar towers, and what analysts describe as sophisticated surveillance and weapons systems. Satellite imagery analyzed by researchers at major think tanks and universities has revealed the steady expansion of these facilities over time, and the picture it paints is of a methodical, long-term strategy to establish forward operating positions that can project military power across the entire region without ever declaring war on anyone. What makes the situation even more complex is a concept that military and geopolitical analysts have come to call gray zone operations. Rather than engaging in open armed conflict, which would immediately trigger international responses and potentially activate defense treaties, China deploys its Coast Guard, its maritime militia, and a fleet of nominally civilian fishing vessels to harass, obstruct, and intimidate. This approach is designed to shift facts on the water incrementally without crossing the legal or political threshold that would justify a formal military response. It is coercion dressed up as law enforcement. It is pressure sustained at a level just below the point where the other side feels justified in shooting back. And it has proven to be devastatingly effective at reshaping the realities of who controls what in the South China Sea. The Philippines sits at the center of this storm in a way no other nation does quite so directly. Manila's exclusive economic zone overlaps with China's claimed territory at multiple critical points, and the two nations have been locked in a confrontation that has grown steadily more dangerous over the past several years. The most visible flashpoint for a long time was Second Thomas Shoal, a partially submerged reef in the Spratly Islands where the Philippines intentionally ran a ship aground in 1999 to assert its territorial claim. That ship, the BRP Sierra Madre, has been slowly rusting ever since, kept afloat by determination and routine resupply missions from the Philippine Coast Guard. China's Coast Guard began aggressively blocking those resupply missions in 2023, using water cannons, laser devices, and physical maneuvers to stop food, fuel, and building materials from reaching the small contingent of Filipino sailors stationed aboard the deteriorating vessel. In June 2024, the confrontations at Second Thomas Shoal reached a level of severity that shocked observers around the world. Chinese Coast Guard personnel rammed a Philippine Navy inflatable boat during a resupply mission and boarded it, using knives and axes to damage the vessel and seizing equipment. Filipino sailors were left injured and humiliated. The footage was filmed and shared widely. It was one of the most direct and documented acts of aggression between the two nations in recent memory, and it prompted an urgent round of diplomatic activity. Within weeks, China and the Philippines announced a provisional agreement aimed at reducing tensions at the shoal. But the pause was brief. By late 2024, incidents at other locations, including Scarborough Shoal, were intensifying rapidly, suggesting that Beijing had simply shifted its focus rather than changed its strategy. Scarborough Shoal, known in the Philippines as Bajo de Masinloc, carries enormous symbolic and legal weight. It sits well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, a fact confirmed by the 2016 international arbitration ruling. China seized effective control of the shoal in 2012 following a standoff with Philippine vessels, and since then Filipino fishermen have been repeatedly blocked from accessing waters their families have fished for generations. The economic impact on coastal communities in the Philippines has been severe. Fishing is not just a livelihood in these communities. It is a cultural identity, a way of life, and for many families, the only source of income they have. When Chinese vessels block access to traditional fishing grounds, the ripple effects go far beyond the waterline. Families lose income. Communities go without food. Children go hungry. These are the human consequences of geopolitical maneuvering that rarely make it into the headlines. In 2025, the situation at Scarborough Shoal escalated dramatically. On August 11, both the Chinese Navy and Coast Guard conducted what analysts described as a coordinated provocation, firing water cannons and participating in a joint ramming operation against the Philippine Coast Guard vessel Sulwan. The Chinese Coast Guard ship involved was itself damaged in the collision. Satellite photographs released in the aftermath showed what appeared to be a floating barrier installed at the mouth of the shoal, effectively sealing off access to the reef's interior. The placement of that barrier, analyzed by researchers affiliated with Stanford University and other institutions, was seen as a direct and calculated effort to physically control who could enter the shoal and under what conditions. It was a concrete escalation that went beyond harassment and entered the territory of permanent occupation by proxy. That same year, the Chinese People's Liberation Army conducted a record 163 documented operations in the South China Sea, according to researchers at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The scope of those operations included live-fire drills, naval patrols, and exercises that send a clear message to neighboring nations about the scale and readiness of Chinese military power in the region. China's maritime militia, a fleet of state-subsidized fishing vessels crewed by personnel with military training, averaged 241 vessels deployed per day throughout 2025, the highest daily average ever recorded. These are not fishing boats looking for fish. They are floating pieces of a strategic presence, deployed in swarms to establish facts at sea that no single diplomatic note or legal ruling can easily undo. The international community has watched all of this unfold with growing alarm, and the United States has been the most prominent voice pushing back. The Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and the Philippines, in place since 1951, commits both nations to treat an armed attack on either one as an attack on both. American officials have repeatedly confirmed that this treaty covers Philippine forces operating in the South China Sea, including Coast Guard vessels. The U.S. military has conducted freedom of navigation operations through the region on a regular basis, sending warships and aircraft through waters that China claims as its own to assert that international law does not recognize Beijing's unilateral restrictions. The message is clear, but the response from Beijing has been equally clear. China has filed formal diplomatic warnings each time and continued its operations without modification. In late 2025, CBS News reported that the United States military's Indo-Pacific Command had quietly issued an order to stage a show of force in response to China's escalating hostilities near the disputed waters, specifically in the context of preparations surrounding a meeting between President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping in South Korea. The plan, which involved a precision strike demonstration, was prepared as an option to send an unambiguous message about American resolve. The fact that such a plan was prepared at all speaks to how seriously American military planners are now treating the trajectory of events in the South China Sea. Whether or not it was ever executed, its existence reflects a level of strategic tension that has no easy diplomatic pathway to resolution. Japan has emerged as a critical player in the regional response to Chinese expansion, and its involvement represents a significant shift in the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific. Japan sold military ships and equipment to the Philippines and Vietnam, and in September 2025, a mutual defense agreement between Japan and the Philippines took effect, representing the deepest security commitment Tokyo has extended to another nation outside its immediate neighborhood in the post-war era. The French Navy participated in joint patrols alongside the U.S. 7th Fleet in the Philippine Sea beginning in 2024. Australia has reinforced its commitments through the AUKUS nuclear submarine pact and regular high-level meetings with American officials focused specifically on countering Chinese maritime coercion. The coalition forming around the Philippines is not a formal alliance yet, but it is becoming something that looks increasingly like one. One of the most underreported dimensions of the conflict is what China has been quietly building in the realm of electronic warfare. Researchers at the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative reported in late 2025 that China had expanded its electronic warfare and surveillance infrastructure across its artificial island bases in the Spratly Islands between 2023 and 2025. Satellite imagery showed new antenna arrays and mobile electronic warfare vehicles deployed on Fiery Cross, Mischief, and Subi reefs, with at least 6 paved sites featuring monopole antennas oriented toward the sea. The implications of this are profound. Electronic warfare capabilities allow a military force to disrupt communications, blind radar systems, and jam the targeting networks that modern military operations depend on. A 2025 report by the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission warned explicitly that China's electronic warfare assets could impair American access to satellites and network sensors across the Indo-Pacific. The economic stakes of what is happening in the South China Sea are difficult to fully comprehend in the abstract, but consider this. Approximately $7 trillion in maritime trade passes through the South China Sea each year. That trade includes the goods that fill stores across North America, Europe, and Asia. Electronics, clothing, automotive parts, raw materials, pharmaceutical ingredients, and agricultural products all move through that corridor. If that trade were disrupted by conflict, even temporarily, the shock to global supply chains would be immediate and painful. Prices would spike. Goods would disappear from shelves. Industries that depend on just-in-time supply chains would face sudden and severe disruptions. The workers who lost jobs and income during pandemic-era supply chain problems would face a similar crisis, but this time without the prospect of a vaccine to resolve it. This is not a theoretical scenario. It is the economic reality that hangs over every confrontation at Scarborough Shoal. For the Philippines, the cost of this conflict is already very real and very personal. Fishing communities along the western coast of the country have seen their incomes shrink dramatically as access to traditional fishing grounds in the West Philippine Sea has been restricted. The fishing industry supports millions of livelihoods across the Philippine archipelago, from the fishermen who go out to sea to the dock workers, processors, traders, and vendors who form the rest of the supply chain. When China deploys dozens of vessels to block access to a reef, it is not merely a geopolitical maneuver. It is an economic intervention that removes income from people who have no other fallback. The cumulative effect of years of such operations on the economic vitality of these communities is profound, and it is a story that does not get told often enough in the context of what is usually framed as a military standoff. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. made a decisive break from the more accommodating approach taken by his predecessor when he took office in June 2022. Under Marcos, the Philippine government has been more transparent about Chinese aggression, releasing footage of confrontations, filing diplomatic protests, and actively deepening security cooperation with the United States and its allies. This shift in posture has made the conflict more visible internationally and has changed the terms of the debate. It has also produced a backlash from Beijing, which has responded to Philippine assertiveness with increased pressure, issuing warnings and escalating its physical presence in response to Manila's decision to install cameras and monitoring equipment on the BRP Sierra Madre. Every step the Philippines takes to document what is happening has been met with an attempt by China to make the documentation irrelevant by simply escalating what it is doing. The Pentagon's annual report to Congress on Chinese military developments, released in late 2025, painted a picture of an institution undergoing significant internal challenges while simultaneously advancing toward its long-term objectives. The report identified corruption scandals within China's rocket force and even documented the pierside sinking of a Chinese submarine during preparation for sea trials, suggesting that internal quality control problems have not been fully resolved. Yet the same report warned explicitly against the assumption that these problems represent a fundamental weakness. China's military capacity continues to grow, its operational tempo in the South China Sea and around Taiwan continues to increase, and its stated goal of achieving significant military capability benchmarks by 2027 remains the organizing objective of the entire institution. The short-term turbulence does not change the long-term direction. What is happening in the South China Sea is not simply a territorial dispute between neighbors who cannot agree on a boundary line. It is a contest over the rules that govern international order. China's rejection of the 2016 arbitration ruling sent a message to the world that legal processes mean nothing when a powerful nation decides that its interests lie elsewhere. If that message is accepted without consequence, it has implications far beyond the South China Sea. It signals to every powerful nation on Earth that the rules-based international order is optional for those with enough strength to ignore it. The nations watching what happens here most closely are not just in Southeast Asia. They are in every region of the world where territorial disputes remain unresolved and where smaller nations depend on international law as their only meaningful protection against larger neighbors. And yet, within all of this tension, within all of this danger, the Filipino fishermen keep going out to sea. Not because they are unaware of the risks. Not because they do not understand the cameras watching them, the ships following them, or the water cannons that may open on them without warning. They go because they have no other choice. Because their families depend on them. Because the fish in those waters have sustained their communities for longer than any of the governments involved in this dispute have existed. There is something in that quiet, stubborn insistence on living that captures the essence of what this conflict is really about at its most human level. It is not about 9-dash lines or satellite imagery or electronic warfare systems, though all of those things matter enormously. It is about whether ordinary people can live their lives in their own waters without a superpower deciding that its ambitions take precedence over their survival. The coming years will determine whether the deterrence architecture being assembled around the Philippines is strong enough to change Beijing's calculus. With over 500 joint military exercises planned between the United States and the Philippines in 2026, with Japan now bound by a mutual defense agreement to Manila, with France and Australia deepening their presence in the region, and with a growing body of documentation making it harder for China to conduct its operations invisibly, the pressure on Beijing is real. But so is China's investment in this contest. With a record maritime militia presence, more than 160 military operations conducted in the South China Sea in a single year, and an ongoing program of electronic warfare expansion across its artificial islands, Beijing has made clear that it has no intention of backing down. The South China Sea is not moving toward resolution. It is moving toward a moment that will define the shape of this century. And the whole world, whether it realizes it yet or not, has a stake in what happens next.